Good evening. Good evening, all, and welcome to our next discussion on building resiliency for climate change. Tonight's session is the third of a 6-meeting series on bay and coastal flooding and fire risk mitigation in our county. Tonight, we focus on Redwood City, south of Whipple, Menlo Park, and East Palo Alto. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Leagues of Women Voters of San Mateo County. I'm Tracy Clark, president of the League of Women Voters, South San Mateo County. At our last forum and in future forums, you'll also see Marie Baldessari, president of the League of Women Voters, North Central San Mateo County. This series of meetings is co-sponsored with OneShoreline, the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. We will have a question and answer session following the presentations. You can submit your questions in the Q&A forum. Simply click on the Q&A icon in the bottom of the Zoom window. A dialog box will come up for you to enter your question. So let's get started. The League of Women Voters is well known as a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to help educate our communities on critical public issues. To that end, the League is delighted to undertake, for the first time, a countywide community discussion series on the impacts of sea level rise and wildfires in order to plan our community response. These discussions will focus specifically on geographical areas that have different potential effects, and therefore different potential solutions. Tonight's forum will focus on the cities of Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, and Redwood City, south of Whipple. We hope to spur our neighbors to engage deeply in this topic and offer their thoughts on how we can best prepare ourselves. I'm delighted to hand the mic to East City Council member and OneShoreline board member, Lisa Gauthier, for her comments.
Hi, my name is Lisa Gauthier. I'm a city council member in the city of East Palo Alto and a resident of the Gardens area in East Palo Alto. Living in the Gardens, I have been impacted by the flood of '98 and 2012, as my house that I grew up in is in the same neighborhood as well. I knew that it was important to be a part of a program that was going to be mindful of what is happening in our community. So in 2012, when I was elected to office, when that flood happened, I was a newly elected individual in the city of East Palo Alto and found myself out on the levee around individuals who were in my community. Since I grew up in the community, I knew many people who were impacted by both floods, having water come through their front windows with a lot of their belongings ending up on the street, having mud 4 feet high in many of the living rooms. And again, if you were impacted by in 1998 and those who turned around to see the same effects in 2012. That is why it was important when I joined, when I was elected to office, to join groups and become an alternate to the SFCJPA Creek JPA that was instrumental in building the levee that protected many of the homes in our community. And why I'm proud to be a member of the Flood and Sea Level Rise District that is looking to make sure that the sea level rise is being handled not just city by city, but it'll be a regional approach, because we know that water knows no boundaries. And if we don't look at this as a regional matter and we don't attack it as a regional matter, we will be just having one city protected. So I'm grateful for Len and all of those who are on the call. This is an issue that's so important to us all. It knows no boundaries and everybody will be impacted. I know even from the KQED story that was shared about East Palo Alto, we know that East Palo Alto is important and all the other cities are important as well. So glad to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. Looking forward to learning more and looking forward to seeing the solution that's going to really impact all of our communities and make us much safer in the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. My name is Len Materman, and I'm the CEO of OneShoreline, which is the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. I'm going to screen share now. I have a presentation. So today is really the third in the series on climate change risk and resiliency in San Mateo County. It's the second in terms of specific geographic scope, and this one is focused on Redwood City south of Whipple, as well as Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. And we're really excited that we're partnering with the League of Women Voters throughout most of this year on this program. So just a bit of background, San Francisco Bay has risen 8 inches since 1900. And of course, future estimates vary widely, but all of the estimates assume more than 8 inches of sea level rise by 2100. And so this graph shows the elevation of San Francisco Bay rising to its current elevation here. And of course, here's the various lines on the graph. At OneShoreline, we're not focusing on this great uncertainty about all of these lines. We're really taking the approach that we want to protect against the most substantial potential for sea level rise. And so we're focused on the elevation up here. And why is that? San Mateo County, some of you may know already, is kind of a poster child for sea level rise vulnerability. We're the most vulnerable county in California to the first 3 feet of sea level rise in terms of population, including underrepresented population, property value, homes, and number of contaminated sites. And we're only one of only 6 counties in the United States, and the only one on the West Coast with over 100,000 people in an area to be impacted by the first 3 feet of sea level rise. And of course, there are many community assets on both the San Francisco Bay side and on the Pacific in terms of schools and beaches and highways and water treatment plants, et cetera, that are vulnerable. So there's a great need in San Mateo County. This is the area that we're talking about tonight. On the upper left is Whipple Road up here. Here's Redwood City, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, and at the lower right of the image is East Palo Alto and the county line between East Palo Alto and Palo Alto. Highway 101 cuts through the image. And unlike most maps that just show where projected sea level rise is going to go, this map is somewhat unique in that it really is mapping more importantly than the location of where water would go. It's mapping the confidence that the federal government, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration has, the confidence they have in where that water will go. And so the areas that are dark blue are very high confidence, and the areas that are orange are low confidence. And we take this map seriously because we want to address we want to give people confidence that what we're doing is going to matter. Essentially, I think of my job as making the California county most vulnerable to sea level rise, resilient to that transformative challenge, and to give people confidence that this is happening now. And so if you look at as sea level rise goes up, there's much greater confidence in what the effects will be. And so that's why it makes sense to us to really focus on the greatest level of sea level rise and address where we have a high confidence the impacts will be. So knowing the threat and knowing the fact that cities alone can't not only solve their sea level rise problem, they can't solve a problem for themselves and their neighbors if the approach is simply jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and that the need to do these projects, in order to do these projects, the need for permits, land rights, state, federal, private funding is all needed. The county got together with the cities, and state legislation was introduced that created the district in January 1st of 2020. So about 16 months ago. And it took some determined, elected, effective champions from the state and federal governments, as well as committed local officials like Lisa Gauthier and her colleagues on our board to lead the district, and a compelling argument for how a new district would add value. And our philosophy is that we add value in 3 fundamental ways. We take a holistic approach to geography by promoting projects and developing projects that align and connect protection from neighboring jurisdictions, a holistic approach to the threat, storms that are made more extreme by climate change and by sea level rise. And so encompassing all the different facets of climate change impacts on the county, and a holistic approach to the objectives by reducing those threats, but also looking at waterways and shorelines as assets that are integral to the community rather than just liabilities, and also looking for recreational opportunities and green infrastructure opportunities and opportunities to utilize private lands. So in our projects, we like to think that we go big, and what go big means is meaningful protection to 10 feet above today's high tide, long-term protection for multiple jurisdictions. So these are big projects that we anticipate not having any regrets about when sea levels continue to rise in the decades to come. Projects that are achievable technically and in terms of money, land, permits, and local support. Very difficult on these complicated big projects, but that's our focus. And then a clear role where our district adds value to these projects. Here's some of the projects that we're focused on. I'll emphasize the ones in pink right now, and we'll talk about Bayfront Canal and Atherton Channel tonight. It's in the area of this particular forum. We're also looking at a new project with Redwood City, San Carlos, the county, and potentially Belmont to look at Redwood Shores. Just north of Redwood Shores, Foster City is doing a project. That's a city-run project to address their levee issues. And then we have a project in Burlingame and Millbrae to connect with San Francisco Airport. And then on the coast side, we're looking at Pillar Point Harbor area and all the assets that are there, county, harbor district, state, federal. The area of tonight's forum, again, is Southern Redwood City, as well as Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. So taking a look, I'm going to address the Redwood City issues primarily, and I'll do it briefly, and then I'll hand it over to colleagues from Menlo Park and the San Francisco Creek JPA to talk about East Palo Alto further. And our colleagues from Menlo Park and the San Francisco Creek JPA and from the city of East Palo Alto and the city of Redwood City are available to answer questions in the question and answer period. So in terms of Redwood City, this map shows Highway 101 cutting through the image, Woodside Road here, and that turns into Seaport Boulevard. And this area I highlight as an area that is already developed, and there are various plans to do additional development or to repurpose development. And we're working, just starting the conversation with the city of Redwood City to think about this area as a kind of holistic approach to how this part of Redwood City will be protected, and to move away from a development by development approach to protecting each particular building on its own development and thinking of it kind of in a more holistic way, as I mentioned earlier. South of there and south of Seaport Boulevard, but north of Marsh Road, this whole area of Redwood City is frontage for the shoreline here. And this is between the populated area of Redwood City that has several mobile home parks, of course, Highway 101, and there's part of Menlo Park. And on the other side of it is a large property, this Cargill Salt Works property. And then I'll say a few comments about that in a minute. And then just south of there is the Bayfront Canal project. So this is what it looks like near Marsh Road. This is the FEMA floodplain map, and there's all kinds of lines. These are jurisdictional lines to show all the cities and the county that are affected in this area. And the blue areas show the FEMA 100-year floodplain. This picture shows in one of those mobile home parks a recent flood, and there have been many recent floods, and I'll talk about that in a second. Here's the Cargill property. Bedwell Bayfront Park is here. You notice it's not in the FEMA flood map. It's very elevated, and so the high ground is not in the floodplain. It's not subject to flooding, but of course all around the park is subject to flooding. We have something called the Bayfront Canal, which flows parallel to the shoreline, and it's met by the Atherton Channel. And I'll talk about a project that we have starting construction. Actually, we're awarding the contract this week as our first district construction project to address the frequent flooding there. This is other pictures from flooding due to the Bayfront Canal. It floods very frequently, 40 significant events since 1951. Planning on this project, it's a small project, but very complicated, began 9 years ago, and we're starting construction, as I said, within the next week or two. And it has the flooding has consequences for public safety, emergency response, of course, property damage, economic damage. This is a view looking along the Bayfront Canal here. This is Menlo Park, and Redwood City is over here. And this is the Bayfront Canal, and here's the Cargill property. And there are there's a lot of kind of discussion of the future of this property. And fortunately, a part of the discussion is flood protection for the area behind it. And there are various ideas about how to accomplish that. And we're kind of working with the parties and looking into what is the potential for providing that flood protection in terms of what the future of the property looks like. As we get closer to Bayfront Canal, I like this picture because it shows the Bayfront Canal. Again, here's Menlo Park, Bayfront Canal flowing into Flood Slough, which then flows to the bay. But we notice in this picture, which is taken by a drone on a rainy day and at a high tide, and you notice the water level in Flood Slough is much higher than it is in the canal. And then, of course, water is pouring upstream into the Bayfront Canal. And that's the reason that there's a flooding problem in this area, is water can't drain when there's a high tide. And so the project to develop the Bayfront Canal or to make it safe for the nearby areas is to create an underground culvert system that takes water out of the Bayfront Canal and sends it into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ponds. That's the project that we're starting this week. And as I said, it's a complicated project, required many permits due to its location, proximity to the bay, a shoreline, easements with Cargill and a couple cities in our district and the county, funding from all those parties, plus Atherton and the state of California. And construction, as I mentioned, starts, we're awarding the contract this week. Construction will start in mid-May, and it will go to approximately the end of the year. And the area shaded in yellow shows the construction area. If you live or work in an area that's either adjacent to this, or you drive by it, or you use Bedwell Bayfront Park, you should be aware that the impacts of construction will begin in a few weeks. And we're working with the city of Menlo Park to communicate those impacts and to reduce them as much as possible. Finally, I just wanted to say quickly, we at the OneShoreline are also implementing a flood early warning system that's countywide, and emergency action plans. And that includes the Bayfront Canal Atherton Channel area. So it includes early warning and emergency action planning by multiple jurisdictions in the watershed that includes the area of this forum. So thanks very much. I'm going to turn it now to Christopher Lamm, who's with the City of Menlo Park.
Thank you, Len. I'm Chris Lamm. I'm the Assistant Public Works Director for the City of Menlo Park, and I've been with the city for a little over 2 years. And in those 2 years, the Bayfront Canal and Atherton Channel project has been front and center, so we're excited to see it go. It's my pleasure tonight to speak with you all regarding climate change, risk, and resilience as it pertains to what's happening in Menlo Park. So a little bit about Menlo Park. We're home to approximately 36,000 residents. The city has an operating budget of approximately $126 million and a capital improvement budget of $21 million. Physically, the city encompasses around 19 square miles, and interestingly, about 7.5 of that is actually located within the bay. So we are, I guess, tuned into what's happening in terms of sea level rise and have been for some time. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about some planning efforts that have been going on to date. Talk about a project that the city has recently applied for some FEMA grant funding, and then finish up with the city's 2030 climate action plan, because addressing sea level rise is the result, and addressing the root cause is also important. So overall, it would take some very unique topographical features for any agency or jurisdiction to be able to solve the sea level rise problem we are facing on their own. As has been mentioned before, water knows no jurisdictional boundaries during a flood, and the city of Menlo Park understands this. As was mentioned also earlier, the city was impacted by the San Francisco Creek flooding in the late 1990s. And as a result, the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority was born as a way to look at a solution to a problem from a multi-jurisdictional perspective. The JPA went on to develop the Safer Bay Plan, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And the cities also sought out inclusion in other regional and multi-jurisdictional efforts, such as the Dumbarton Bridge West Approach and Adjacent Communities Resiliency Study that was completed in 2020 by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, looking specifically at the Dumbarton Bridge. And it's one of the reasons that Menlo Park was so eager to see the formation and support the sea level rise district OneShoreline. So the Safer Bay Plan, developed in 2016, identified a series of improvements, or the reaches, that could be made starting down at the mouth of the San Francisco Creek in East Palo Alto, and continuing northwards towards the Dumbarton Bridge and west to Menlo Park's border with Redwood City. The project objectives were defined to protect against the 100-year flood, and it would remove properties from the FEMA floodplain associated with tidal flooding. It provide additional resilience against future sea level rise, sustain marsh habitat and facilitate marsh restoration, and create opportunities for partnerships with other agencies and organizations that were pursuing similar goals and objectives. So one of those opportunities actually presented itself late last year when FEMA announced a new grant program called the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant. The city, in collaboration with PG&E, the San Francisco Creek, and Facebook, submitted a project to construct several of the reaches identified in the Safer Bay feasibility report. It will complete basically portions of reaches 2, full completion of reaches 3 and 4, and a portion of reach 5 from the feasibility report. It provided levee improvements along the majority of Menlo Park's shoreline, providing coastal flood protection and sea level rise resiliency to residential neighborhoods, businesses, and critical electrical infrastructure. Using nature-based solutions, the levee will allow for habitat restoration of over 550 acres of former salt ponds, and increase public recreational access. So that the total project cost is estimated to be about $66 million right now. We're requesting the maximum value that can be granted under the FEMA program, which is $50 million. And through this public-private partnership, the PG and Facebook would provide the matching funds of $16 million to get to the full 66. If awarded, and we should hopefully know later this summer if this project is selected, the estimated project duration is 5 years, including the design and construction. So that would put us at completion in approximately 2026. This picture I blatantly stole from the OneShoreline website, but I think it highlights kind of the necessity of this project. So this is a PG&E substation located just off of the Bayshore Expressway, and so you can see the Dumbarton Bridge off to the right there, heading over the bay. The substation here serves the majority of San Mateo County on the peninsula. So it's expected that this substation represents one of the primary sources of power for about a 250,000 residents on the peninsula, and really highlights that the sea level rise problem is not just a problem for those that are located in the flood zones and down near the bay, but really impacts our entire community and should be thought of in such a way. So finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't include some information on the City of Menlo Park's climate action plan. The city thinks of itself as a leader in terms of tackling climate and climate-related problems. The 2030 climate action plan highlighted six goals that the city wants to achieve. So the first is to explore a policy and a program to convert 95% of all existing buildings to be all electric by 2030. So about a little over a year ago, the city implemented REACH codes for new buildings. So the city has requirements that all new construction, with a few exceptions, build to all electric standards, and this would continue that to existing buildings. The action plan sets a citywide goal for increasing electric vehicles and decreasing its reliance on gasoline. It seeks to expand access to electric vehicle charging for multifamily and commercial properties, citing that that's a barrier to entry for a lot of individuals that want to utilize electric vehicles but don't have the means to charge them. It seeks to reduce vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, by 25%. Eliminate all use of fossil fuels from municipal operations. So that's including the city's fleet, tools, and buildings. And then finally, as we're talking about tonight, develop a climate adaptation plan to protect the community from sea level rise and flooding. So down on the right, there is a link to the city's climate action plan. If you want to get some more information on that, our sustainability team and our environmental quality commission worked hard on this, and it's been the topic of a lot of discussion on how to achieve these goals. And so with that, I will hand it off to Margaret Bruce.
Thank you so much, Chris. My name is Margaret Bruce. I am the Executive Director at the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority. I am delighted to be with you this evening, and I want to thank Len Materman for inviting me to participate in this panel, as well as the League of Women Voters for hosting these very informative and, I hope, helpful sessions that encourage our community members to be aware and to participate in these important issues. So let me get started here. I am in the enviable position, perhaps, of batting cleanup, and some of what I'm going to share is going to be redundant. One of the things that Len shared was the map that showed the sea level rise impacts along the Bay margin. This is another example of that. This comes from a recent KQED publication, and I think you can find this on their website. All of these dots along the map represent places, infrastructure, critical services and functions that will be impacted by sea level rise. As we think about what Chris said, there are going to be impacts that are so much beyond just those residents, businesses, or infrastructure that is proximate to the Bay. It also impacts anyone who uses power, needs to flush a toilet, wants to take an airplane flight someplace, commutes on Highway 101 or across the Dumbarton Bridge, or in other ways utilizes the resources and the spaces that are along the Bay margins. So protecting these critical regions is important not only for our immediate community members affected by sea level rise and storm and tide flooding, but also for the critical infrastructure that we as denizens of this region count on. So Chris talked about Menlo Park's approach to addressing climate change. On one side, you have mitigation. And I want to interject here a moment to describe the difference between mitigation that you'll hear about when we talk about our large projects. All of us who are implementing levees, flood walls, and other kinds of mitigation measures for climate change have to reduce the impact of those projects by having mitigation. In other words, kind of restoration efforts that offset the impacts of these climate change adaptation projects. So you'll hear the word mitigation used for those things too. In our case, it looks like restoring marshes. Mitigation in the context of climate change, though, means reducing our emissions. we will need to have a rapid, massive, structural, economy-wide change to how we generate and use energy, how we use our land spaces, how we manage all of those emissions sources. Individually, we can do what we can. It will require a massive structural shift to reduce climate changing emissions so that the work that we're doing in adaptation can stand the test of time. Because climate changing emissions has such a long latency period in the atmosphere, we have to do a rather significant amount of mitigation, but we have already created enough emissions in our atmosphere that we will have to adapt. When Len showed the curve demonstrating the different probabilities of sea level rise, over and over again, we're seeing how climate change scientists are saying we're reaching our highest estimated, or perhaps in some cases exceeding our highest estimated guesses of what impacts would be at this time. So preventing or protecting ourselves against 10 feet of sea level rise is a very rational approach. Now on to the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority. What are we doing specifically to address the risks of flooding from sea level rise and tidal inundation? In this map, you will see a series of, a dashed line here that generally indicates the same kind of alignment that Chris showed you when he was talking about the Safer Bay Project. The Safer Bay Project connects here with the endpoint of the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority Reach 1 or downstream project, and then proceeds in 9 segments all around East Palo Alto and Menlo Park, and joins here where Len was talking about the Atherton Channel project and Bayfront and the Bedwell Park. Another important thing that I want to point out about this map, if you see the legend here, we're looking at 3 different kinds of colors. For those of you who are colorblind, there are 3 colors. Blue represents creek flooding. Green represents tidal flooding. Red represents where they overlap. The San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority is working in 2 additional segments of the creek. This middle part here between Highway 101, which crosses your screen here, and Pope Chaucer Bridge, which is about here where my cursor is and where this blue area commences from. This is our Reach 2 project. Through a series of efforts, including replacing the Pope Chaucer Bridge, which right now creates a channel constriction, and widening the channel in key locations between Pope Chaucer Bridge and Highway 101, we can alleviate a majority of this flooding. Working together with Reach 1's completed project and this stretch, once completed, we will reduce the risk of flooding to many of these green areas, many of these blue and pink areas. However, it's not until we work through the Reach 3 or upstream projects where we will need to find storm detention capacity to bring us to the what's called 100-year flood protection and take all of these areas in, when Safer Bay is finished, all of the green areas, and when Reaches 2 and 3 are completed, all of the remaining areas out of the floodplain. This is an important long-term investment because we know that many residents are impacted by the FEMA flood insurance requirement that those who are subject to tidal inundation and creek inundation have to pay. Those insurance costs are not insignificant, particularly if you are in a low income community and a high risk income or high risk for flooding community. It's important also to know that very recently, FEMA has announced what's called risk 2.0. FEMA's changing their methodology for insurance risk calculations. They hope that and they intend this new approach to be more equitable, more streamlined, and clearer. The specific cost impacts to residents who are now paying into the National Flood Insurance Program, who are in the FEMA floodplain, may have to pay more or may pay less. So that is going to be a change that is coming up. Once in a while, FEMA also adjusts where they consider flooding to be a high-risk location. So as they change their flood maps, hopefully our projects will also be able to accommodate for those increasing or changing FEMA flood map designations. So I think I'm going to conclude my remarks there and just say the JPA has more information available about its projects on our website. Please contact us. Please feel free to email or call any of us. Our information is posted on our website. Again, thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting this event. And I'd now like to turn this over to Ora Chaiken of the League of Women Voters, who will be our moderator for Q&A after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret and Chris and Len. This is Ora. I'll start with one of the questions that follows on from Margaret and Chris's presentation. There were questions about the reaches that were discussed in both of your presentations, and trying to understand if the reaches are just numerically listed or whether they signify 3 foot versus 10 foot increments of flood damage. So maybe you could just address that, Margaret or Chris.
Sure, thank you, Ora. The reaches are designated 1 through 9 simply in numerical order. There isn't anything reflecting prioritization or size or timing or the level of effort or the level of height of the levee. It's just a sequential order of breaking the reaches into geographically logical components.
Great, thank you for that. And then, Chris, have anything to add to that?
Nope.
All right.
That covers it.
Perfect. We'll go on to the next question. This is from Pam, who wants to know, do we know what areas may be prone to liquefaction, and have any studies been done or are planned for those areas? And I don't know if that's a subject matter for Margaret, Chris, or Len, if any of you have comments on that.
You know, I guess the only thing I would say on that is, in terms of liquefaction, I assume that that the question is about in the situation of an earthquake. And the levees, when they're constructed, in order to be certified by the federal government such that the communities behind them can then be taken out of the flood insurance program. And everything that all of us are talking about tonight are levees that would be certified by the federal government. There are certain standards that assume a very significant earthquake within a certain radius, and I don't remember exactly what the distance is, but there are standards in terms of how the levees are designed and then compacted and then built that have to assume a certain level of earthquake in the area.
All right, thank you, Len. We'll go on to a next question directed to Chris. This is specifically about Menlo Park's 2030 goals that you presented. And the question is, are the goals applicable to all the buildings in Menlo Park or just the city-owned buildings? And this refers to, for instance, 95% of the buildings will be electric.
So the goal is for really 100% of the city buildings to be to be all electric and to stop using gas. But the climate action plan item is to look at all existing buildings in Menlo Park.
Thank you, Chris. Next questions, I think, relate to Margaret's presentation when you mentioned FEMA. So first, when will FEMA make the changes that you had indicated?
You can go onto the FEMA website. Their presentation is, their intention is to have their FEMA Risk 2.0 become effective October 1st of this year.
That's great. And someone had asked a follow-on question about how to find out more about the FEMA mappings and standards, and I assume those are also on the FEMA website.
Yes, and it's easy to find, and we can send out follow-up links if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Thank you. And if any of the other panelists have specific links to provide, they can answer them in the Q&A. So next question for Len and team. Do the current projects that are planned, so that includes the Atherton Channel, the Safer Bay, San Francisco Creek, provide comprehensive protection to all of the communities affected by sea level rise in this area? If not, what are the areas that need further protection, and what's the timeline to ensure those projects are planned? Very broad question.
Yeah, so the idea of having all of us here is that we're all talking to each other and making sure that the various efforts are aligned and connected. And that's a challenge. Different government agencies moving in different paces on different projects. But we are, the Menlo Park is one of the funders of our district during its startup phase, as are the other 19 cities in San Mateo County. And so they're a part of us in that way. Menlo Park is a member agency of the JPA. And so I think that communication is happening. I think all of the projects have similarly aggressive sea level rise protection objectives, and that's great news. It's not like one of the projects is building to a much lower standard, and that would be worrisome, I think, for all of us. For example, the Bayfront Canal is not really a sea level rise project. It's to protect against the frequent flooding, at least every other year on average, for the areas that I described. The sea level rise project would come later and connect into the SAFER project, and it would come later adjacent to between the Cargill property and the other properties, as I mentioned. And so these various efforts are complicated. They're at different phases, but the good news is on the early planning side, which has been going on and we're in now, it's planned in a way that would be aligned and connected to a very similar level of protection.
Thanks. And Margaret or Chris, do you have anything to add to that? All right, we'll go on to a question. I think it was referring to what Chris showed. How is the power station by the Dumbarton Bridge going to be protected? Is there a plan that's been developed for that?
Right. So as part of our grant application, we do have a conceptual design of how to achieve the protection for the reaches that are included in the grant. So around the PG&E substation, it would be a series of levees. These would be horizontal levees that allow for also environmental benefits in addition to just the flood protection.
Thank you.
Can I chime in there briefly about the benefits of those horizontal levees?
Please do.
So Len showed a really interesting slide that looked at that 10-foot inundation and how high into our landscape that goes. When you start flooding marshes, all of the ecosystems that are now in marshland become inundated too. So by having a horizontal levee, you actually provide a space where it's called upland refugia, where ecosystems can move upland and species can move upland with them as the sea level rises.
Thank you. All right, next question, probably for Len and team. What is OneShoreline's plan to consider all threats and hazards near the bay? Sea levees and walls can't keep out rising water tables, which will increase the soil liquefaction. And they mention a Bay Nature article, The Sea Beneath Us, that gives an overview of that.
Yeah, I mean, the only way I can describe it now is to say that in all of our planning and design, we take into account the potential undermining of these levees. And, we're all of these projects work in the bay mud environment, which is a tricky environment in which to design this infrastructure that has to withstand earthquakes and needs to last for decades, et cetera. So it's really just in the engineering process to include things like sea level intrusion into groundwater and how it might undermine these levees. It's super complicated. Several of these areas, on one hand, have high value habitat with the marshes. There's the sea level intrusion issue. On the other side, you have the utilities right up against it. You have obviously homes and businesses. And sometimes you have underground contamination, and working with all those factors at the same time is complicated. But that's the value of taking a big swath, I think, of geography and working on these projects, is that you can accommodate all the impacts and derive multiple benefits by working in a regional perspective. If you just take one piece at a time, you might have such substantive impacts that it makes it impossible to just build that piece of the project. And as we talked about before, if any one link area is missing, then you lose the benefit of the entire project. And so that's why these projects need to be large. And planned in a comprehensive way geographically, and to accommodate the threats that the question talks about.
Great. So there's a good natural follow-on question to that that says water will seek its own level. So where on the South Bay is the lowest point where sea level rise will naturally be directed? Are there models to address sea level rise throughout the whole South Bay? So maybe that would help to understand first for OneShoreline what the length of the shoreline is that's within your domain, and then address the question.
So I can start at that, and I don't know if Margaret or Chris want to add. In terms of OneShoreline, it's the extent of San Mateo County. So on the bay side, it's from Brisbane to East Palo Alto. The SAFER project is led by the JPA, and Menlo Park is a key partner of that, as is the city of East Palo Alto. And OneShoreline is supporting that. And as I said, our work to the north of that is connected into that project. But as I showed in my slide, we're interested in Redwood Shores and Millbrae, Burlingame, South San Francisco, San Mateo, Brisbane, all the cities on the bay, as well as the coast side. In terms of the vulnerability in the bay, what's interesting is probably the greatest vulnerability, if you think about the bay as a funnel, and the lowest point on that funnel is the South Bay. It's large, at the Golden Gate, of course, but even then between San Francisco and Oakland, relative to the Dumbarton area where it gets quite close together. The good news on that is that the South Bay is the area with the greatest number of marshes, and the marshes in the South Bay are being restored. There's a large project that has been going on for a couple of decades called the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, and it's really about turning former salt ponds into marshes, or at least areas that can act like marshes. They're managed ponds or marshes, and they can absorb some of the effects of sea level rise. So the area where we need the marshes the most, fortunately, is in the area we're talking about, which is part of the former salt ponds, Ravenswood. Of course, there's the Cargill property, which is still a salt works property right now. But then to the south of that, as you go around towards San Jose and El Viso, and then you go up the side of the East Bay, there are former salt ponds that are being converted to managed ponds and marshes that can absorb some of that water.
Great, thank you so much. Switching topics a bit, there's a question about the seawall and the amount of sea level rise that protects against. So the question is, can you clarify the number of additional feet of sea level rise that a 10-foot high seawall can protect against during storm surge, etc.? And the person thought they heard mention that a 10-foot wall above normal present high tide level can protect against flooding associated with a 3-foot sea level rise, not a 10-foot sea level rise. So just trying to understand all those different dynamics there.
Yeah, I hopefully I can. Margaret, do you want me to take that, or? Okay, all right. Right. So there are different ways to think about the elevations, right? So in my mind, the cleanest way to talk about this is what's relative to today's daily high tide. Because most people, as throughout their lives, they hear the term high tide. They're somewhat, if they're familiar with tides at all, they're somewhat familiar with the concept of a high tide and maybe where that occurs adjacent to their community or a beach they go to or something like that. So when I think of our objectives at OneShoreline, it's 10 feet above the average of the daily high tide, the higher of the two high tides, that average, add 10 feet, that's the elevation of what we build, that protects against that elevation for San Francisco Bay. Now, I think what the question gets to is, well, how does that relate to the 100-year tide or a storm tide? Because obviously that's going to be less protection during a major storm because the storm will be higher than the high tide. And so if you break it down, like let's just say somebody wants, their objective was not anything relative to high tide. They want to get out of the FEMA flood insurance program. That's their objective. And there are a lot of projects that pursue that as an objective. I'll explain why I don't think that makes a lot of sense. The FEMA 100-year tide is about 4 feet above the daily high tide in San Francisco Bay. Okay, so at San Francisco Creek, East Palo Alto, the daily high tide is called about 7 feet. And that's relative to some datum that's been developed by scientists decades ago. So let's just call it 7 feet. If you add 7 feet, if you add 4 feet to that, you get 11 feet. That's the FEMA 100-year tide. If you build a protection project just to get somebody out of the FEMA floodplain, you have to add 2 more feet. That's called freeboard, which is kind of margin of error in case it's an extra high tide or more than the 100-year tide. So then you go from 7 feet to 11 feet of the FEMA 100-year. Then you add 2 more feet, you get to 13 feet. You add 3 more feet to that, you get to 16 feet. That's almost the same. It's about a foot less as 10 feet above today's high tide. Okay, so it really doesn't matter how you think about it. And that's why the other part of the equation is, well, what year are you protecting against? Because you have all these curves. One curve will go to 2050 or 2100, or that's not helpful to people who are figuring out how to protect communities. What's helpful is you pick a number that's aggressive in the sense of it's going to provide substantial protection over a long period of time, and you build to that number. And it doesn't really matter if you talk about it in terms of FEMA. You want to go way beyond FEMA 100-year floodplain, as we're all talking about here. And it doesn't matter if you talk about years, because these projects are going to last for decades. It's not like they're going to break in 10 years. If they do, then there's other problems, but they're not going to. And so essentially what you want to do is you want to pick a substantial number and move forward. And 10 feet above today's high tide, I think, is the cleanest way to explain it.
Great, thank you. All right, and when you presented the portfolio of projects initially, you had the ones that were, run by OneShoreline, and other ones where you were partnering. Does that get to that level of protection that you want, or do you need to have double the number of projects, or is there a way of thinking about it that way?
I mean, our objective is that level of protection. There are certain areas where it's possible we won't meet that objective because of constraints of either species or utilities or land rights or whatever. But at the moment, we don't see those areas. They're not apparent to us. That's impossible to get to. And so it's not you don't have to build multiple projects. You build a consistent, aligned, connected, aggressive level of protection once on the shoreline, and that addresses your issue.
Great, thank you. There's been a couple questions about the early warning system and how it works, and will it be installed in East Palo Alto and Menlo Park, or along all the levees in all the cities in the OneShoreline jurisdiction?
So I'll ask Margaret for some help on this too, because the JPA has had an early warning system for a while, and it's being updated as we speak, almost, I think. In terms of our early warning system, we're instituting it not along the shoreline. It's early warning for weather events, for extreme storms. And so we're installing gauges in streams, including Atherton Channel. That's the closest one to the subject that we're talking about tonight, but it's up and down the county: Colma Creek, San Mateo Creek, and San Bruno. And so we're installing these, and what that's about is when there's a major storm that comes through, water comes in the channel, and in areas that are subject to flooding occasionally, we want to give people advance warning and emergency responders advance warning that that's coming. But Margaret, you may want to add to that for this area.
Sure. Thanks, Len. So the flood early warning system that the JPA has utilizes stream sensors in the upland areas, in the watershed, in the tributaries of the San Francisco Creek. That information is aggregated to a central, like a confluence point, and gives us at least an hour's heads up if there's going to be a potential for flooding further downstream. So say, for example, at our problem choke point at Pope Chaucer. If we get that reading from up in the tributaries, we can give our community members and our emergency operations colleagues in Menlo Park and Palo Alto and East Palo Alto and in the counties about an hour's notice that there's a peak flow coming down.
Thank you. Switching topics again, this is about the Cargill salt flats. It said development on Cargill is controversial. And Len, I think that you mentioned OneShoreline is talking with Cargill about flood protection on the site. And there's just a question more about the nature of those discussions and what's planned there.
So as people who have been following this will know, there's been a lot of kind of political movement and legal movement around the Cargill property for a long time. And, you know, I don't know what the future of Cargill property holds. What I do know is that there are conversations about it moving forward in a way that will enable protection against sea level rise, and that's my focus, right? I can't comment on what the property might be used for otherwise, but we're trying to make sure that the areas of Redwood City, the county, Menlo Park, and all the areas on the west side of Highway 101 that are also in those inundation maps. It's not just right along the Cargill property. Downtown Redwood City is part of that. And so we're just trying to make sure that in the context of the future of the Cargill property, sea level rise protection is front and center, along with all the other objectives that people have for that property.
Thanks. Next question for Chris and team. So many large building projects are in the pipeline for Redwood City as well as Menlo Park. Is there a way to add adaptation requirements or modify these developments? I don't know if you can, speak for Redwood City as well, what the approach is, but are some of these new building projects required to have adaptation or modifications?
Thank you. Well, I definitely cannot speak for Redwood City, but Menlo Park did a general plan amendment or general plan update in 2016, commonly known as Connect Menlo for those Menlo Park listeners that are familiar. There are requirements in the Connect Menlo general plan update that require developments to pay their fair share of the sea level rise resiliency. The city to date has not developed a fee to implement on those projects, so we have not been able to collect those funds to work on these. So we've been focusing on the Safer Bay as the avenue to achieve the resiliency and the looking at that opportunity with the BRIC program to take a big bite out of the levies that are needed.
Thank you. This question is probably for Len. Can you share more about the flood prevention plans for Redwood Shores and the status of those plans?
Sure. In fact, today, the city of Redwood City applied for a grant to do conceptual design and the early phases of an environmental impact report process a project that would be led by OneShoreline. Redwood City was an applicant because it was eligible under the program, the grant program through Cal OES and FEMA. And so that project would also include San Carlos and the county airport is in Redwood Shores. Silicon Valley Clean Water, Samtrans has a major site. Silicon Valley Clean Water has the water treatment plant, and potentially Belmont. So it's a large multi-jurisdictional project. Right now, we're just in the phase of kind of getting the partners organized, establishing what their roles are, what their financial commitments will be, what their other commitments would be. And so it's at the very early phases. We hope to, we're encouraged about this grant. The grant program came to us about applying. And so we're encouraged, but it's not done by any stretch. We just applied today. And so we'll see where that goes. I would say if we do get the grant, we would start in earnest in early 2022. So in about eight or 9 months.
Thank you. Chris, back to you on this question, or maybe tying into Margaret. What are Menlo Park's plans to take a holistic approach to development near the Bay? The question seems to indicate that it seems like there's a project by project basis for development, and not necessarily appearing that there's a holistic plan and consideration of risks and hazards that weren't considered during the Connect Menlo process. So maybe you can speak to what the overall plan is for development near the Bay.
Right. So I think there's not really much more to add from the previous discussion on the development and what's included in the Connect Menlo in terms of the requirements. So the Connect Menlo general plan update, like I said, did take into account and acknowledge the need to address sea level rise in it. So I think it is being considered, and it's not necessarily a project by project piecemeal approach.
Thank you. I don't know, Margaret, if you have anything to add to that. All right. So then there's some more nature and conservancy questions. First, how will legacy contaminants or pollutants in the sediments of the Bay mudflats affect marshland ecosystems?
Len, do you want to take a stab at that, or?
Sure,
Okay,
I can take a stab at that. So my frame of reference on that is in East Palo Alto, and it's not so much the underground contaminants in the marsh, and I can't speak to whether they exist or not, but the contaminants adjacent to the marsh in the property that used to be industrial sites that are very close to the marsh. They're right along the marsh. And these are well-known sites that are being monitored, that the cleanup of which is being monitored and led by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And so on those sites, the complication is those sites are being, as I said, managed and monitored by US EPA. And on those sites, the question is how to build a levee that's partly within that property that does not disturb the very complex, expensive approaches to capping and keeping those contaminants from draining or somehow migrating into the marsh. So that's about all I can say. Anything beyond that will exceed my area of expertise on this topic. Margaret, I don't know if, or Chris, do you want to add anything?
Just really briefly, the kinds of contaminants that are present may determine how and what moves back and forth from the contaminated area to the marsh area. So things like volatile organics can be mobilized pretty easily. Things like metals tend to stay put. So again, if there are levee creation projects that also cap and kind of immobilize surface materials that are contaminated, that might actually help minimize contamination that could get loose and go into the marshes. So as Len said, it's really complicated and it depends. There is a certain amount of contamination that's, kind of like climate change. We've already bought it and it's going to happen. It's going to be there. It's going to attenuate over time.
Maybe, Cora, could I add one more thing to that?
Okay.
So the way that our area treated the Bay 50, 60 years ago, compared to what our kind of belief is about the value of ecosystems in the Bay, was just awful, right? And there was a lot of activity on the Bay that we really regret. And as we go into these big projects and try to build new infrastructure that's environmentally sustainable and provide sea level rise protection, we encounter not just the very small particles that Margaret and I were just talking about, but we encounter very large things that were dumped there decades ago that are buried that we don't really necessarily know about until we start digging. And so that's a real complicating factor for these projects is the unknowns of what we'll find along the shoreline. I mean, essentially the shoreline of the Bay in many places was just considered a landfill and not necessarily a closed and capped landfill. It was just a landfill. And so we're finding that now as we go along the Bay and try to, make amends and improve the situation for what was done decades ago.
All right, let me ask a follow-on question that may or may not push your boundaries of your knowledge, but will the sea level rise move these sediments to some particular area of the Bay? Do we see like not just the rise overall, but where it's pushing things?
So there was I can speak for at least the San Mateo County Bay shoreline. There was a study done that I would be glad to share with folks that are interested in this particular topic, done by an organization called Point Blue. And they're a well-regarded science organization that studies the Bay. And it was completed maybe in 2018, 2019. It was relatively recent. And it looked at, with sea level rise, where will sediments move around the Bay, and looked at specific marshes. And, it's easy to think of, okay, and Margaret was talking about this before when she was talking about horizontal levees. It's not a simple linear equation to say, the marsh is at this elevation today, and if you add 3 feet of sea level or 8 feet of sea level, whatever, it's just going to be 3 or 8 feet underwater. As the questioner indicated, sediment will move around the Bay and get deposited in certain areas. And in some ways, nature will take care of this problem by itself in the marsh. It won't take care of the problem in terms of the developed areas. They'll still get water, but in the marsh, the deposition of sediment will keep pace with the rising water of the Bay. Not in all areas, but if somebody wants to dive into this, they can send us an email at info@oneshoreline.org, and I'll send them the Point Blue report. It's pretty interesting.
Thank you. Can you address, I guess directed to all of you, the issue of habitat squeeze as we have more and more development and habitat for other wildlife in the area, and is that factored into all of the plans that you're working on for sea level rise mitigation?
Yeah, that's a great question. For the Safer Bay project, those 9 reaches are actually what's considered a self-mitigating project, because by creating that protection along the frontage part of, it goes around PG&E, along the approach to Dumbarton, around Facebook's Classic Campus, and then up along the Bayshore Road, that allows us to restore ponds R1 and R2, those large, what once were salt ponds on the Bay side and sort of like north and east of the power station. Those 2 ponds are about 550 acres of high quality opportunity for marsh restoration, for a diverse Bay shore habitat restoration. So are we factoring in the ecosystem squeeze? Absolutely. The regulatory agencies are keen to make sure that we keep that in balance. Yes, we need to build sea level rise protection. We will also be doing habitat restoration.
Thank you. I think that's appreciated. Next question for Len, asking, will OneShoreline, or adapting to rising tides, model how the projected sea level rise flooding impacts would change with the completion of all 9 levee reaches? So I don't know if the map goes back to the initial state of tides not rising, or what is the impact with all of these projects?
Could you say that again, please? I'm trying to.
Can OneShoreline model how the impacts would change with the completion of all 9 levee reaches that you had mapped out?
So these, when the question about 9 levee reaches, I assume they're referring to the Safer Bay project. Can we map the effect of building those levees?
Right.
Yeah, I think we can. We can look at what the effect of building those levees would be in terms of so-called hydrodynamics and how the water will flow in the surrounding areas. And that's probably a worthwhile exercise. I did want to mention, I just looked in the chat room and or whatever it's called, and Mark Munzer, who's community development director in Redwood City, offered to augment an answer regarding Redwood Shores. I don't know if that's still pertinent, but I just want to acknowledge that was there, and Mark's a great resource from the Redwood City perspective on any of these questions.
Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I just wanted to add thank you to my former colleague, Chris Lamm. I didn't expect you to be able to answer for Redwood City. I will say briefly in terms of adaptation and planning for sea level rise adaptation with developments that we have in Redwood City, that, as Len noted previously, it had been done on more of a case-by-case basis, certainly closer to the Bay. We are now taking a more holistic approach to that, so preparing for sea level rise and the different actions that we can take. We do have a few levees in place, or a levee in place along the Seaport Boulevard area, and also doing some long-term, long-range planning in our Inner Harbor area, which is just east of 101, kind of Seaport Maple Street is some additional planning we're doing. And then also in reference to proposed development in Redwood City, there's really 3 buckets that we're focused on right now. We have our transit district plan, which is around the downtown Caltrain station. The gatekeeper process was a series of development projects that are in and around the downtown area. And then the central Redwood City plan, which will be the successor long-range plan to the city's downtown precise plan. Those 3 initiatives will talk to one another and, of course, take into account adaptations for sea level rise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now, question for any of you to answer is, who in Santa Clara County, specifically Palo Alto, is leading a similar effort? If there is a similar effort going on, maybe you can describe the next county down along the Bay, what's going on there, and who are contacts there.
Sure. The Santa Clara Valley Water District, that now goes by the term Valley Water, is leading the effort. They have what they call the Shoreline Project, and you can look up information about that project on their website. A specific project of theirs in Palo Alto is the Palo Alto, what do they call it? The Flood Basin Tide Gates project is a very interesting and important element of the Santa Clara County shoreline effort that protects the residents in the proximity of, I think it's Barron Creek and 2 others that spill into that flood basin, and the tide gates then that control that area. So again, Valley Water, and check out Shoreline Project.
And I'll just add to what Margaret said. The city of Palo Alto, as other jurisdictions are, like Silicon Valley Clean Water and Redwood Shores and multiple cities that have water treatment plants, the city of Palo Alto is looking at the sea level rise vulnerability of that water treatment plant, which is near Bixby Park, just south of kind of where Embarcadero ends, and the golf course. And so there's a project there that the public can learn about as well.
All right, we have two questions related to the horizontal levies or levies in general. So one is asking just for a little bit more information about how those levies work, and then what's the comparison to the wall that's currently being built in Foster City? How does that compare to our 10-foot goal?
So levees are constructed utilizing engineering standards for not only their shape and size, but also the kind of material they're made of. So Len was talking earlier about how FEMA engineered levees have to withstand a certain amount of earthquake stress. They have to have a certain limitation for how much the compacted earth can settle. So all of those factors and more are taken into consideration in their construction. Len, you may know more about the specific area in question.
Foster City.
Yeah.
So Foster City, their project is under construction now. Foster City was told by FEMA that the whole of the city would be included in the FEMA flood map, flood zone, and therefore subject to flood insurance if they didn't build that levee. That similar messaging has come regarding Redwood Shores, and but it's years behind the Foster City situation in terms of FEMA and in terms of the project. I'm not exactly sure the elevation that Foster City's levee is being built to. I know it's definitely getting people out of the FEMA floodplain. I think there's some accommodation for additional sea level rise, but I don't have that number in my head. And so also on the horizontal levee question that was just asked, basically you have a standard levee. It has a relatively standard slope. A lot of times it's 3:1 is the ratio of the slopes of the side of a levee. And then a horizontal levee is just adding to that slope on top of the 3:1 to make a very, very gradual slope. As Margaret talked about earlier, it adds it's also called an ecotone levee, the horizontal levee. And it's called ecotone because there are these different tones or zones of habitat or ecology, as Margaret said, that critters can scurry up if there's a high tide that comes in, and just the general kind of different zones of habitat that exist within marshes can exist over a very gradual slope. Some of the slopes go or are proposed to go from 3:1 to 100:1. So they're extremely gradual slopes on these levees. And essentially it's just a very, very gradual slope up the marsh towards the developed areas. And it does several things. In addition to the habitat value, it also protects the levee behind it from the wave action and the surges of water. And as these plants take hold, you can imagine that absorbs the energy of the waves instead of the side of a levee that would get kind of pounded by the bay. And then finally, marshes are more efficient at capturing and storing carbon than any other ecosystem. And so there's a if you think of climate change, and what we're talking about today is the defensive side of climate change related to the climate change equation, where we're defending natural systems and human populations, et cetera, from climate change. There's also the offensive side of reducing carbon. Marshes really do both.
Thank you. So moving, this is probably for Len, question about prioritization of resources. So we have projects in East Palo Alto. Are they competing for funds for projects in Menlo Park? And so how is there a regional prioritization as to what projects need to come first?
Well, the projects in East Palo Alto and Menlo Park that we've talked about today are really led by the JPA and the two cities. And so, I'd leave it to Margaret and Chris and East Palo Alto staff or Lisa Gauthier to discuss that. In terms of prioritization, from our perspective for the other parts of this county, I talked about what what projects we're focused on and what we want them to have in terms of multi-jurisdictional, meaningful objectives, achievable outcomes, local support, where we add value. So, it's kind of we're a new entity. We were created 16 months ago. We have very limited staff, 2 project managers who are on the call, Colin Martirana and McKenna Wong, and a finance manager, Lucy Dong, and myself. And so we're trying to apportion these limited resources to move these projects along as much as possible. It's a challenge. Margaret or Chris, do you want to address anything about local prioritization here?
I think our prioritization is, I hate to say this, it's opportunistic. We need to get through the environmental review of the entire Safer Bay project. Once that's accomplished, the prioritization of our tasks, actually, whether it's from East Palo Alto moving north to Menlo Park, depends largely on when funding is available. So we have a grant application pending from the Cal OES FEMA. It's called a hazard mitigation grant. So if that comes in first, we will work on that part of the project first. If our BRIC grant, as Chris was mentioning, comes in, we'll do that one first. So it depends on, when it rains.
Literally and figuratively. So this is a question for Chris and maybe Mark. I'm not sure Mark's role particularly. When new developments are planned in low-lying areas, how might a city contain the financial risk of developing those projects to reside with the project owners? Otherwise, is there a risk that the developers profit and then leave after selling the projects, and then leave the costs for sea level rise mitigation being borne on the cities themselves rather than on the developers of those projects?
Yeah, well, I would just say that's why it is so important to have these plans in place of how we're addressing sea level rise prior to the developments being approved and going into place. In Menlo Park, we have the Safer Bay plan, which is kind of our overarching plan of how we intend to address sea level rise in the region. And we also have requirements to address the absolutely current FEMA floodplains and what projects need to be built to. We have had some projects that have gone above and beyond the current FEMA floodplain, and they've built their projects up higher than needed, but it's not really the long-term solution, right? Because you can build your building up higher, but as was mentioned, I think in the question, if all the roads and everything else around is flooded, that doesn't really do you any good. So the plan is to complete these levees and complete this system of levees to protect the entire region.
Thank you. Switching back to the topic of the early warning system for flooding, and I think Margaret, when you mentioned it would give an hour warning, the follow-up question is that an hour's notice doesn't seem like a lot of time, especially for some residents who have are different languages or who might not have cars or other access. So are you working with the Zone Haven evacuation zone effort or other community-based groups on evacuation planning and exercises?
That's a great question, Aura. So at the moment, the JPA's system has its own notification process, and our board has directed us to look at changing that and reconciling our notification systems with the Zone Haven and other kinds of like this San Mateo County Alert and Alerts Santa Clara County. So there are already more advanced, more comprehensive, certainly more sophisticated alert systems than the JPA is operating now. So while we will continue doing that monitoring, real-time monitoring of creek flows and some predictive modeling for when the peak will come down to the middle reaches through the neighborhoods and urbanized areas of the San Francisco Creek, the alerts are going to get better by utilizing things like Zone Haven. We just won't be doing it. They will. They're better at it than we are.
Great. All right. Next question. This might be the last one. So noting that new infrastructure, new development will increase road traffic and tolls. Are any of you planning with the Water Emergency Transit Authority, WETA, about amphibious water transit for Redwood City, Foster City, East Palo Alto, etc.?
Can I chime in?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So the city of Redwood City, the city council earlier this year accepted a feasibility plan for a commuter ferry service to explore commuter ferry service between Redwood City and San Francisco and Redwood City and Oakland. So the feasibility plan was the very first step in the process. So we will now move to the business planning phase for a potential commuter ferry. And this is with our partners, which are RETA and the Port of Redwood City. If it were to move past that phase, then you would go into CEQA environmental review and then ultimately planning for it. So we are looking at it as part of our transportation plan, but it's in its beginning stages.
Great. One last question, probably for Len. So how will the planning that's being done on this side of the bay impact the shorelines on the East Bay? And are you working in concert with them to avoid having a high wall this way so everything goes to the east?
Yeah, I mean, there's no studies yet that say that if you raise a levee 3 feet on one side, then several miles away there's an increased impact. But that's certainly we're talking with my colleague. I'm talking with my colleagues in the countywide agencies around the Bay. And that's one of the areas that we're thinking of looking at, is exactly how do you quantify that? And there are studies that there's a researcher at UC Berkeley that has looked at similar questions, but not that exact question. So it is something to think about. It's also something to think about if Foster City builds a levee, what is the impact on Redwood Shores? That's much closer and worth looking at. So these are important questions, and it gets to kind of the hydrodynamics that was raised earlier, and it's an area for further study. It's not an area that should keep us from moving forward on these things. As someone said in a meeting I was in a long time ago, climate change won't wait for a permit, and we got to get moving on these projects. And as Margaret said, as funding becomes available, we need to put our foot on the accelerator in terms of planning, design, and permitting and building this level of protection.
That was a very great ending to the Q&A section, Len. And we definitely, I think I'm speaking for everyone who's been asking questions and listening today, we definitely appreciate the fact that you're not waiting and moving full steam ahead to protect all of us and our Bay. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Tracy Clark from the League of Women Voters, and who will close out the session and will answer the last question, which is how can we access the slides from today's presentation? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Aura. And to the entire audience, those questions were fabulous. They were detailed and interesting. And to our speakers who could answer them so well, please join me in thanking these representatives and officials. Lisa Gauthier from East Palo Alto, Chris Lamm from Menlo Park, Margaret Bruce from the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority, Len Materman. Okay. We'd love for you to join us on our next forum, June 3rd, 7 p.m. This forum will focus countywide on fire mitigation efforts and strategies. So watch the websites. The leagues promote these, both North and South County, and that will be a little broader focus, and it's going to be really good. If you'd like to view tonight's presentation again or share it with others, you can view it in both English and Spanish on YouTube. And if questions come to mind that you have wished that you had asked, send them to oneshoreline.org/LWV-forums. Now, in terms of the slides for tonight, McKenna, can you comment? Or is this something we need to consolidate from all the speakers?
Yeah, I can work on making those available if possible.
Okay, so an email to OneShoreline will get you to McKenna, and she will be organizing the slides for tonight. Okay, well, it's been a total pleasure to be with all of you. We're looking forward to the next event in June. Thank you for being here, and have a good evening.